Beyond the Gates spoilers teased that the safe little world Leslie had built for herself, a small apartment above a bakery, a steady if uninspired job cataloging vinyl at a used record shop, the Sunday dinners at Peach's cluttered kitchen table was stitched together from other people's secrets, and that those seams were starting to show. For weeks the news had been an ache at the edge of her life, a whisper here, an old magazine interview there, the sudden re-release of Articulate's greatest hits with a remastered liner note that mentioned Barbara in a way that felt like an accusation. Weeks earlier Leslie finally had the confirmation she'd spent all of her 20s denying, the woman she'd thought of as a ghost in photos, the woman who had sometimes hummed behind the curtains of Peach's stories, was her birth mother. Barbara of Articulate. Barbara whose name, until now, had been a rumor wrapped in velvet, glamorous, tragic, framed by cigarette smoke and stage lights. Leslie had grown up with a single story about where she came from. She was not an accident, she was an act of love by people too complicated to explain. Peaches, when the subject came up, would always shuffle her cards, laugh a little too brightly, and tell a story about a woman who wore her heart on the collar of a denim jacket and used to sing with a voice that made the floor vibrate. It never occurred to Leslie to challenge that narrative because the facts were small and soft: a locket with a picture of a woman labeled B, a faded set list from a reunion show, a sealed envelope in Peach's dresser that said, in handwriting as slanted as a falling star, "For the child only if she asks." When at 29 the urge to know her own history finally grew louder than the habit of living inside other people's silences, Leslie asked. The confirmation arrived not in a dramatic DNA report, though there had been one, paid for in cash and secrecy, but in a single, brittle photograph that Peaches laid on the kitchen table like a loaded gun. The picture showed Barbara in full stage armor, sequins catching the flash, a smear of red lipstick, eyes that were all challenge. Behind her, half obscured, were the other members of Articulate. In the corner of the photograph, written in Barbara's marred script, was the name Leslie. Peach's mouth twitched. She handed over the envelope. Inside were a handful of things Barbara had left, a string of Polaroids, a ticket stub, a torn lyric sheet, and the one object that would become Leslie's anchor, a tiny, hand-stitched bird made from the cuff of Barbara's performance jacket. Peaches explained in a voice strung taut with old fear that Barbara had left the bird with her and asked that if anything ever happened, Peaches should keep the child safe. She was scared, Peaches said, and she was clever enough not to let that fear win. Leslie's weeks after that photograph were a tangle of research and reeling. The band's name, Articulate, kept popping up like a ghost in contemporary interviews, nostalgia pieces, essays about the era's sound, a biography that treated the band like a myth. Each article had a footnote, each footnote had a rumor. The most insistent rumor, the one that left a bitter taste in Leslie's mouth, was about Anita. Anita, who had been the band's cool center, a woman whose stagecraft could make an audience forget the cold, who later, after Barbara's death, became a cautionary tale in soberer columns. The factory of gossip had once decided with the same cruel efficiency someone uses when they need a scapegoat that Anita's betrayal drove Barbara to suicide. Anita had, the story ran, engineered a humiliation so thorough that Barbara took her own life on a rain-swept night, and that this shame was the original sin that would haunt the band for decades. The truth, it turned out, was far more complicated and far uglier. Leslie learned the details in slow stages, bits and pieces that were dotted across interviews, a cracked diary entry, a recording someone had digitized and posted as a curiosity to the internet, comments on message boards from people who swore they'd been there. If the world had been simpler, if the music press had not loved the arc of tragedy so readily, the story might have been contained: a band with big egos, the pressure to produce, whispering tension. But what stitched everything together was one man, Dante. He was smart, polished, the kind of person who smelled like success. In the public photographs he was always in profile, a jaw shaped by the exact light that sculpted charisma out of bone. On stage he knew where to place a look. Off stage he understood public narrative the way a surgeon understands anatomy. For a long time he had been Articulate's production savant, the one who negotiated better contracts, who knew how to get the right songs to the right radio shows. He was, in rumor, also the sort of person who believed rules didn't apply unless they benefited him. The outline of what happened between Dante and Barbara is small and brutal. In bars and back alleys of the band's history, people said Dante had seduced Barbara under the pretense of collaboration. The line between a late-night conversation about art and a predatory promise is thin when one person holds the power to make or break a career. Barbara got pregnant, which would have been, in any honest world, another reason to call a halt to the machine and protect a person who had given the band its heartbeat. But Dante, whose fear of scandal was as acute as his ambition, saw danger. A pregnancy could unbalance everything he'd built. So the story goes, Dante coerced Barbara into an abortion she did not want, or, in some accounts, he persuaded her that an abortion would be the only practical way forward. When that failed to be enough, when Barbara's resolve hardened and she threatened to expose him, to tell the truth about what had happened, to use the leverage of her body as the only real bargaining chip a woman in their position had left, he shifted from persuasion to pressure. He hired people who were good at making fears feel inevitable. People were sent to the edges of Barbara's life with threats, with the kind of quiet menaces that left a woman feeling watched and small. There is brutality in the way power protects itself. What Dante couldn't afford was a scandal. What he could afford was a body removed. So when Barbara returned in a rage of intention, the sort of zeal that happens when someone decides to stop being a footnote in someone else's story, Dante decided to bury her. He is said to have hired men to force her out of the band, then to have hired men to make sure she never came back. The night they claimed was a suicide was neat in its cruelty, a staged scene, a forged note left where it would sting the most. The kind of evidence that turns an investigation into a closed book. The suicide note itself was a work of artful malice, written in a hand that imitated Barbara's slant. It blamed Anita and the band's betrayal, a final flourish to redirect the conversation away from something Dante could not bear to see talked about in the open. Anita, who had been the natural target for such rage, the leader, the one who had once argued publicly with Barbara over the direction of their music, was easier to break than most people knew. The note landed like a stone and rippled outward. Anita's career cratered under the weight of collective moral outrage. She had friends disappear. Journalists stopped returning calls. The band's label distanced itself. The story that lodged in the press was simple and consuming. Anita's betrayal drove Barbara to kill herself. In the court of public opinion, simple stories have force. They are easier to repeat and harder to interrogate. That is the version Dante expected. Except it ignored the smallest thing. Barbara had been clever in a way the world did not credit her for. She had been terrified, yes, but she had also been strategic. When backed into a corner, mothers do things that are raw with survival. Instead of ending the pregnancy or letting whatever threat Dante posed devour her, Barbara had made a different choice. She gave birth secretly, carefully, and with the kind of attention that suggests she expected to have to disappear afterwards. She entrusted the child to Peaches. She smuggled the baby into a life that was small and safe rather than into the life Dante inhabited, which glittered and could be weaponized. For Barbara, survival meant extraction, leaving behind her name and voice but making sure the line continued. That baby was Leslie. Leslie, who had lived a life of small certainties, was therefore an accident that contained intention. She had grown up on the quiet grace of Peaches's kitchen and the slow love of a woman who had once been a backup vocalist and then a saint in domestic disguise. Leslie's childhood was not ignorant. She knew the outlines of things. She knew that the world had been unkind to the people she loved. But nothing had prepared her for the discovery that shame had been purchased for her, that someone had arranged the narrative and placed guilt on the shoulders of a woman who had been, for years, a scapegoat. Anita's reaction to Barbara's death was the kind of thing that settles into a person like a disease. She retreated, then reacted by trying to atone. The thing that made her story complicated was not just that she might have been innocent, it was that Anita, even if innocent, carried a kind of public humility that turned into self-punishment. Believing herself responsible whether because of a forged note or because of the weight of artistic rivalry that had once had her sharp, she began to make gestures that were less about legal responsibility and more about moral salvage. She set up a trust fund. She sent money anonymously at first and then openly, as if offering restitution could somehow replace a life. The trust would be for the child of Barbara, a quiet thing with a legal name, clauses, and the kind of bureaucracy that says we want to make amends by putting money where grief sits. Anita's money bought an education, a string of attempted reparations. It bought Leslie a small independence many children of the music business never see. It did not, however, buy peace. Anita lived under the impression, truly and deeply, that she had been the pivot on which Barbara's despair turned. That belief became a self-hatred she wore like an old sweater. She performed rituals of apology, public statements that read like obituaries, donations to charities named after Barbara, an annual press release on the anniversary of the death in which Anita would call herself flawed and remorseful. The public, hungry for a satisfying arc, accepted those apologies in the way an audience accepts a well-performed confession. The narrative had been retooled. The villain was not Dante, the manipulator who had orchestrated threats and then murder. The villain had been the visible woman on stage who had survived. For Anita, the weight of guilt was not a rational thing, it was a psychic fact. That was Dante's triumph. He made his danger look like someone else's failure. Leslie's reaction to all of this was an incendiary blend of confusion and focus. When she found out her mother was Barbara, she felt not just grief but a sudden, furious hunger for coherent story. She had been given two contradictory histories, one where Anita was the cruel betrayer and another where Anita had done the only thing she could think to do after being wrongly accused: create a trust in penance. Leslie's mind, pragmatic from years of cataloging and indexing, started to seek pattern. Important things, she believed, would leave a mark. Patterns were proof. She started small. Leslie sat in the record shop after hours and listened to old articulate albums. She read old interviews, printed and annotated them. She pestered a few surviving members of the band who lived quieter lives now. She asked questions and took notes. The edges of Dante's carefully staged world began to fray when Leslie found interviews where he never answered directly, where a pause came right before a question about Barbara's last days. In one old radio interview he laughed when asked about the band's internal politics, and in another, he steered conversation from morality to music theory with the ease of someone who had practiced redirection until it became a reflex. He was, if nothing else, practiced in the art of narrative. Clues began to present themselves in the small things left behind. Barbara's lyric sheet, which Peaches had kept folded like a map, had a stanza crossed out and rewritten in a way that suddenly made Leslie's heart pound. A line about the man who keeps the lights on scratched out and the replacement line about the man who breaks you written in a hurry. A cassette tape labeled with Barbara's name contained a recording of a late-night rehearsal in which someone off-mic, a voice Leslie recognized only later as Dante's, said something sharp enough to be a threat. The audio was clipped, as if somebody had stopped the tape on purpose. There was a stage prop, too, a feathered boa that smelled faintly of Barbara's perfume and which, if you looked closely, had a tear at a seam as if someone had yanked it in anger. Sometimes, evidence is not a dramatic revelation but a cluster of annoyances that, when placed together, create an outline where nothing was before. Leslie's search was not purely forensic. It was also a process of decoding people. Anita answered an email months after Leslie's discovery, not with a demand for distance but with an invitation. "Come to the rehearsal room," she wrote, in her authoritative, simple script. "Bring any questions you have." Leslie accepted, despite the trembling of mistrust. She arrived early, hand stuffed in her coat. Anita was older now, thinner, skin like porcelain that had been dropped and repaired. She looked at Leslie with a woman's fierce tenderness and with a guilt that sharpened her features. They sat amid old amps and cracked leather chairs, where the smell of cigarette smoke and old tobacco seemed to be absorbed into the wallpaper. Anita, who had been publicly ruined, was privately exhausted. "What do you want to know?" Anita asked. Leslie wanted to know everything and nothing at all. She wanted to know why Barbara had been silenced, why someone had written a note that broke a life, who Dante really was behind his charm. Anita answered in pieces. She confessed to being in the middle of an argument with Barbara once, over a lyric, a petty human thing that had been magnified into a tragedy, and she admitted that she had been a small, sharp thing in Barbara's life. But she also told Leslie the truth, more or less, that she had no hand in Barbara's death, that she had been framed by a note that she'd never seen before it was presented to the police, that she had sat with the accusation and allowed herself to be destroyed by it because she could not build a defense in a world that had already decided her guilty. It was Anita who explained the trust fund to Leslie. "I thought," Anita said, with a rawness that made her voice nearly a whisper, "that if I gave money, some of it might undo what I'd done." She had believed in penance as a currency. She had never imagined it would fund her own torment's redemption in the form of peace for the child she loved by makeshift. Leslie, newly in possession of the legal documents, discovered that the trust had been structured with a particular coldness. Anita had tried to be invisible in it. She had not sought medals or public forgiving. The trust was a quiet river with an unexpected shore. When Leslie asked about Dante directly, Anita's face closed like the lid of a box. She admitted she'd suspected him long ago. There had been a pattern of protection around Dante and the band. He never let anyone see the strings he pulled. He was always too smooth, she said. He could make any story flatter. He'd tighten the leash until the truth looked like nothing more than an accident. Anita remembered how, in the immediate aftermath, Dante had been the one to arrange the band's statement, to call the label, to shape the language that would be repeated in press conferences and gossip. That control had not been neutral. It had been a way to manage blame. Leslie's investigation began to gather momentum. She found a woman who had once worked as a production assistant and who, terrified of her own safety, whispered a memory about a man who asked too many questions about a rehearsal schedule on the day Barbara left. She found a handwritten note in the bottom of a guitar case, Barbara's hand, scrawled in a way that suggested she had written in a hurry, that said simply, "Protect her." It was unclear who she meant. The child, Peaches, herself? The pronoun hung like a claim. It is worth pausing here to think about motive the way a detective might. Dante had a clear one. A pregnancy threatened his carefully nurtured image and his economic calculus. Threats of exposure risked his leverage. A woman accusing him, even quietly, was a hazard. He could not allow that. So the logic of coercion follows: discredit the accuser, make the opposition look like betrayal, and ensure the narrative that sticks is the one he can control. He forged the note in the way a painter adds glaze to a portrait with the practiced hands of someone who knows how light will fall. He hired men to make sure the note had the impact he needed. It blamed Anita and rewired the public's sense of blame away from his own culpability. The moral geometry here is grim. Dante's entire defense was to manufacture a past in which he never existed as a perpetrator, only as a protector of the band's image. He was, in other words, the kind of villain the world is built to nourish, the polished one whose hands are never marked by the work he has done. Leslie, newly aware of all this, felt an urgency that would not go away. She was not a woman with a background in law or in investigative journalism. She was someone who had spent her life cataloging the lives of other people through their music. But this was her life, too. The trust fund drew an invisible line between her and the truth, and she wanted to know whether the money that had saved her childhood had been purchased by a lie. If so, what did ownership mean? Would she have been better off never knowing? Could money buy the future away from the past? Her search started to yield specifics. In a dusty storage locker leased in the band's name, she found a folder of invoices, payments paid to anonymous contractors, payments padded in a way that suggested a cover-up. Among the invoices was a receipt for a van rental 2 days before Barbara's death, a van that had been registered in the company that dissolved shortly afterwards. The pattern was not proof, it was lead. But when combined with the cassette where Dante's off-mic voice suggested menace and the torn lyric sheet, those leads created a shape of culpability that felt undeniable. Yet even as the evidence mounted, there remained the hum of ambiguity. People lie, they cover, They fold. Evidence can be destroyed. The men who had been hired to threaten women are often ghosts. Proof, Leslie discovered, is not always the straightforward thing banked in a courthouse. It is, more often, the accumulation of small consistent things that point to intention. And Dante was the pattern maker par excellence. He had constructed a narrative that suited him and then styled the world to match. It is there, in the middle sweep of this story, where the stakes become personal as well as moral. Leslie was not only trying to finish a cold case puzzle, she was trying to reclaim a lineage that had been stolen and miscast. Knowing her mother was Barbara changed how Leslie looked at herself. The lilt of a phrase in conversation, the way she reached for a cigarette in a movie she had never seen, an aesthetic sensibility that leaned towards theatricalite. These were not random traits but residuum of a mother she'd never known. And to learn that the person who had made her mother a ghost might be still living, still walking the world with the same cold charisma, made the search both urgent and dangerous. As the days ran into each other, Leslie assembled a dossier. She taped copies of invoices to the wall of her small apartment, interspersing them with lyrics and Polaroids. She listened to the cassette until the hiss between the words felt like a pulse. She wrote the names of people who had died and those who had vanished in permanent black marker. She made a map of the city in which the band had once lived, marking with pushpins the places that no longer existed on Google Maps. It was a ritual of order against the chaos of a history that had been miswritten. If there is one quiet truth in stories like these, it is that the living never really stop wanting to be recognized by the dead. Leslie wanted her mother to be recognized for who she had been, for the things she had sung about and for the way she had chosen to keep a child safe at the cost of everything else. She wanted Anita, if not absolution, at least the knowledge that she had not caused Barbara's death. Anita wanted truth like a human wants air, simple, immediate, a thing one cannot barter with money or good deeds. Dante, for his part, wanted the narrative intact because otherwise the scaffolding of his life would topple. The weeks of Leslie's inquiry led her to a final, incandescent lead, a tape hidden in the hollow of a drum, marked in Barbara's handwriting with the single word, "Listen." Her fingers trembled as she fed it into an old cassette player contributed by a sympathetic record shop manager. The tape started with noise, applause, microphone static, and then Barbara's voice, warm and immediate. Leslie's breath hitched. Barbara was talking to someone, or to herself, in that way people do when they know a truth must be recorded in case it is needed later. The voice was gentle and fierce. She spoke of fear, of being watched, of a man who had smiled too smoothly. There was a pause, then a single sentence that made Leslie's skin prickle. "If anything happens, Peaches has her. Protect her." The tape cut. There was a rustle. The last seconds had been erased or left blank on purpose. The silence that followed was a cleaving. Leslie sat with the player's dead hum and felt the world pitch around her. That sentence, "protect her," was not the end of a story so much as the hinge. It proved Barbara had acted intentionally to save a child. It proved someone had tried to silence her. It proved, more importantly, that Dante had underestimated the kind of woman he had humiliated. Barbara had not been entirely destroyed. She had left a path. At the same time, the tape did not offer the kind of proof that a court could act on. It did not contain the voice of Dante admitting to a plotted murder. It did not place his fingerprints on a gun. It did, however, give Leslie something she had not had, a reason to believe that the accusations leveled at Anita were not only wrong but deliberately manufactured. It gave her anger and a map of where to look next. But it also raised the stakes. A man who could hire people to silence a singer was not a man who would ignore an intruder rifling through the past. Leslie realized that the hunt she had set herself upon might wake things Dante had tried very hard to keep asleep. So she kept the tape in a shoebox and did what people do when they are building toward an unknown end. She prepared. She updated the dossier. She wrote letters she would never send. She tightened her routine into a predictable pattern so that when something unexpected happened she would know. She called Peaches and told her she was coming by. She told Anita what she had found. Anita, who had once been accused of a crime she did not commit, listened with a steadiness Leslie had not expected, and then, when Leslie had finished recounting the cassette's last sentence, Anita reached for Leslie's hand and squeezed it like a plea and like an apology all at once. The search, then, had reached a point of no return. Leslie had proof that was both luminous and dangerous, and she had named a man in her mind who, according to the scattered evidence, had ruined multiple lives to preserve his image. In the audio, in the receipts, in the torn lyric sheet, in the feathered boa, the same shapes repeated themselves like a chorus. Dante's voice was absent in anything that would hold up in court, but his presence saturated the margins of everyone's stories. He was the antagonist in a drama whose ending had not yet been written. And so Leslie stood at the edge not of a revelation but of action. She had begun to stitch together the truth about her mother, the manipulations that had led to a framed suicide, the cruel gifts of penance that had been offered as consolation, and the clandestine life her mother had woven to protect her. She now knew enough to feel both vindicated and primed for what must come next.